next we will do is an opener. So I have a Kahoot. Is that everybody? Okay, I'm gonna get started. Okay, so living in a disadvantaged neighborhood increases your chances of victim violence by how much? It is 25.1%. All right. Next question. In communities, what are considered direct forms of violence? It is all of the above. That's correct. Good job, everybody. All right. Oh, wow. Lead change. All right, next question. In 2009, how many violent crimes were committed in the US? It is 4.3 million. All right, next, true or false? The second leading cause of death is homicide. Yes, correct, it is true. And, oh wow, Steph is in the lead now. And how many Americans are victims of homicide? It is 18,000. All right, Steph, congrats for winning. But really, in my book, all of us are winners. Yes. Okay. So that was just a little opener to come into today's topic, which is neighborhood and built environment, safety, crime, and violence. So, not that. So I just wanted to talk about conditions in neighborhoods. The environment of a community mostly affects people's health, and in poorer areas, there are higher rates of crime, pollution, fast food restaurants and advertisements, and those encourage cigarette and alcohol use as a result. In poorer neighborhoods, there are less safe spaces, and because of that, a lot of parents don't like their children going outside, and as a result, they may not exercise as much, and that could lead to obesity. Children in higher poverty areas are more likely to live in inadequate housing as a result, which can expose them to a list of health risks, And 2 here are lead poisoning and asthma. And children who are in high poverty areas or disadvantaged communities are more likely to attend substandard schools, and fewer work possibilities are in those areas, which might hinder their social mobility and hence their health across generations. So I wanted to break down what constitutes as violence and crime, because usually people mix those two up. And violence is just an act of physical aggression or results in self-harm, and crime is just the violation of the law or the act of deviance from established results. And here on the left, you can see that violence can include bullying, child abuse, elder abuse, intentional harm, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and youth violence. And as a result of violence, there are a list of health effects. One, it can affect people's mental health, and people whose mental health are affected by violence can experience depression, stress, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use disorder. And people who experience domestic violence experience depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicidal thoughts. And like I said before, with violence, and parents are sometimes concerned about their children walking in these neighborhoods or playing outside, and that could stop people from getting their daily physical activity, which can result in weight and obesity or weight gain. And more pressing issues could result in cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, and diabetes. And here I just have a photo at the bottom here trying to show how violence can induce chronic illnesses such as asthma, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, and ulcers. And they can also exacerbate risky behaviors such as alcoholism, drug abuse, and smoking. And you can also get infectious diseases such as HIV and STDs. So community structures influence child development to crime and delinquency. And as you know, children who are in places with low socioeconomic or people who are in minority communities are at risk for having or doing poor things or poor consequences, which can induce criminal behavior. And much of because of children and how they are influenced to do these things, they are more likely to drop out of school, because if they're living in a low socioeconomic area and there's not a lot of jobs, or their jobs that they get are going to give them starvation wages, they don't see that there's a reason to go to school if that's what their reality is going to be. And as a result, you can see a lot of children having worse academic accomplishments, having less language ability, and a variety of other issues. So I just want to highlight 4 different models that are seen in children when they are involved in poor neighborhoods that influence crime and delinquency. So with the first model is called the Neighbors Institutional Resource Model. And that just shows that how in low income neighborhoods and in children especially, there's not a lot of neighborhood resources. And so that impedes on their play, how they shape their lives, and can be seen in adults and children. And the resources that I am mentioning here in this model are libraries, community centers. Another resource could be like job resources or job ready centers and things like that. The second model I want to talk about is the Congleton model. And that just shows that children like to mimic other things that are seen by their peers. And so if their peers are doing things such as crime or they're in gangs, they're more likely to follow and be a part. So that's why you see a lot of them either in drugs, crime, and other things that are not considered, that are considered negative behaviors. The third model I want to highlight is the competition model. And so people in low-income neighborhoods don't have a lot of resources. And so because of that, the resources that they do get is very limited. And that's why you see a lot of people in these neighborhoods, they compete. And so that's why you also see a lot of violence as they're fighting over these resources because they are scarce. And so that can lead to negative behaviors as a result in children and adolescents. And lastly, I want to talk about is the collective socialization model. And so in low-income communities, they really do need role models. And so your biggest role model is usually your parents and the guardians. And so when you see parents or guardians who are influenced or doing drugs or alcohol and other things or in crime or gangs for that matter, children start to internalize that and they think that that's how they should live their lives when they become adults. But as you know, those are all negative behaviors that children don't see if they're living in households that have these things or parents or guardians that do these things. So as you know, people in low-income communities need structure and they need more opportunities so that children could be better stewards and things like that. So here, I just wanted to give some stats and facts. So exposure to violence in children may be seen in adults and can result in greater substance use, risky sexual behavior, and unsafe driving behavior. And individuals exposed to violence at any age are more likely to engage in or experience intimate partner violence. And as you know, 1 in every 4 persons in the US, which is 25.7%, lives in a high poverty neighborhood. And a high poverty neighborhood is where 20% of the residents are poor. And at the bottom here, I just wanted to show a comparison of how usually there's not a lot of opportunities such as good access to food. And that is because companies do not want to be placed in areas that have high levels of crime or violence. And so as you can see here, when companies because companies are not seen in areas with high levels of crime and violence, that results in these low-income communities or sometimes minority communities having what is called food deserts, and food deserts is basically where residents have few options for purchasing fresh foods. And so I have an arrow showing the violence and social disadvantage model, and that's just showing the example that I have on the right, how greater exposure to violence is associated to social disadvantage, and in that case, leads to poor health. And here on the top right, I just wanted to highlight the a model here that shows the risk of homicide increases with increasing portions of neighborhood residents who have not completed high school. And I said before, low-income communities or some minority communities do not think that finishing high school is very important, as if they're going to graduate or come out being or going into starvation wages with the jobs that they get, then they don't think it's very important to finish school. So why should you care? Well, low-income communities and some minority communities, there's this idea of gentrification and how if you want to help build up the area, they need to bring in people who are considered affluent or wealthy to help build up the communities. But if there's a lot of violence and crime, affluent people are not going to want to move into those areas. So that is why we need to better clean up the areas and help give them better opportunities and resources so that the areas could be better, and so affluent people would want to come in. And also, children who are in these communities, they need to understand that they are the building blocks, and they are ones that can be instilled with values and knowledge, and they need to know that there's more to life than just violence and crime, and that they have a way to better themselves, and that once they do that, they can better society in a positive way. So lastly, I just want to highlight some things and ways that we can help better prevent violence. And so right here I have is the social ecological model for violence prevention. And there is a list of ways. So the first one is with the individual level, is with education and life skills training. And so that's when people come to different schools and they talk about how even though that there's violence and crime in their area, that there's ways that they can better themselves in a positive way. The second thing here is mentoring and peer programs. So usually when you see in low-income communities, a lot of nonprofits or organizations come in and they do mentoring. And what they do is sometimes you see people coming in and having the children talk about what's going on in their communities and ways that they can better the situations that they're in. And sometimes you see them in circles talking, and that's just the person coming in to mentor or give them guidance. The third thing is the social norm and social marketing. So like I said previously, there's sometimes is messaging that's put in low income and sometimes minority communities that are negative, and they exasperate the violence and crime and shows that it's a very positive thing to do. But if we were to change that and put billboards and other things like that in low income communities, then that might change their mind's perspectives and make them not want to do that. And lastly, I want to talk about the policymakers. And so with policies, we can help better the communities and give them resources that they need, as obviously that is why they're in the situations that they're in. And that's all I have for the presentation. And these are my sources. Okay. And now we have Nick Cotter. Yes. Would you like to introduce yourself, Nick?
Yeah, sure. It's Cotter, but that's close enough to what you said.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
It's a weird last name. Yeah, sure. You know what, Tiffany, do you want me to just bring up my slides now? I think I have an introduction in there on the first one. Am I able to
Yeah,
share slides?
yeah.
Great. Let me do that. I'm trying to see where I have oh, there we go. Just popped up. Okay. Can everybody see this okay?
Yeah.
I'll move this up. Okay. Yeah, so Tiffany, thanks for having me. As a bit of an introduction, just on the slide, I'm going to be talking to you all about the causes and consequences of community violence in Allegheny County. Tiffany had reached out to me. I think, Tiffany, you saw some of my work on my blog. My name is Nick Cotter. I'm an analyst with the Allegheny County Department of Human Services. I do research there on neighborhoods, community violence, and affordable housing policy, in particular, the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I'm also a freelance writer for Public Source, where I typically write about the subjects that I just talked about in terms of what I research for my job. And I'm also the creator of the Pittsburgh Neighborhood Project, which is a blog really dedicated to educating individuals in our region on the causes and consequences of persistent racial and economic segregation, also trying to bring a light to our communities that don't always get a spotlight for good and for bad, and trying to lift up resident voices through the blog, through interviews, data analysis, and other sort of different formats. And so, as I said, I'm going to be talking to you all about community violence today. Tiffany, I think you said between 20 to 30 minutes. If it's getting a little too long, just let me know. And I got a timer on here. So yeah, we can always have time for questions here, but I'll try to get through this in about 20 minutes or so if that works for folks.
Okay.
So to really just start, I just kind of want to go with this statement about community violence and its incredible amount of concentration in our highly needy communities. So all people, regardless of race or socioeconomic status, deserve to live in neighborhoods that are safe and free of community violence. However, as we're going to explore today, community violence is not randomly distributed. It is heavily concentrated in just a small number of higher need communities and overwhelmingly cuts short the lives of young Black men. On average, homicides occur in just 0.3% of Blacks in Allegheny County per year, with 79% of these Blacks residing in higher need communities. We'll get into what I mean by higher need communities a bit later in the presentation. Despite Black men making up only 6% of the county's population, as we'll see, they make up close to 70% of annual homicide victims in any given year. And most of these victims fall between the ages of 15 and 34. We'll be getting into this detail throughout the presentation, but I just wanted to sort of anchor us as we start to talk about this incredibly intense issue in our community. So I kind of want to start high level and then zoom in. When Tiffany reached out, she mentioned really talking about the spatial element of community violence, which we'll get to as we go throughout the presentation. But I wanted to first kind of give us a general sort of overview of violence in Allegheny County. So typically when we say the phrase community violence, what we mean by that is gun violence that primarily occurs in our public spaces. It tends to be distinct from other forms of violence, like say domestic violence or other forms of interpersonal violence, because of the fact that it tends to be concentrated in our higher need communities, again, within public spaces, and also because the victims overwhelmingly tend to be male, unlike, say, domestic violence. And when we're talking about community violence, one of the most ways we can most accurately measure it is through homicide trends and also non-fatal shootings, which we'll get to a little bit later in the presentation. So overall, when we talk about homicide trends in Allegheny County, important thing to note that if we look at homicides, really over a little more than a decade here from 2007 onward, using data from the Allegheny County Office of the Medical Examiner, prior to 2020, homicides had been decreasing a bit since 2016, despite still in spite of those fluctuations, still remaining, quite high in the county. There was a 17% increase in homicides from 2019 to 2020, which reversed some of the positive gains we had saw from 2016 through the end of 2019. And lastly, there was a 39% increase in homicides from 2020 to 2021. This data is actually a bit old on this slide, so it was actually more like about a 40% increase, and that was looking at data for the year. So when we look at homicides and non-fatal shooting trends in the city of Pittsburgh, we again focused in see a similar trend where violence has been persistent over a lot of the last decade, but we have seen some dips, particularly in 2017 and 2018. Important thing to mention about Pittsburgh is it makes up about 25% of the county's population, but annually tends to be at least 40% or more of all homicides. Like the county overall, we saw an increase in homicides from the city of Pittsburgh in 2020. We also saw a similar increase in 2021. Again, I apologize, the data on this was from a past presentation, so it's a little old on the increase in 2020 and 2021, but those were substantial if we extend those to the end of the year. Important thing to bring up on this slide as well is that if you look at the chart, we have homicides and non-fatal shootings. And the only data we actually have at DHS for all of the really sort of public safety facing data in the county is homicide. So we have that for every municipality in the county through the Office of the Medical Examiner. The only place we actually get non-fatal data, which comes from our police departments, is for the city of Pittsburgh. And as we can see here, homicides, which are in the darker orange bar, on any given year only make up about 25% of all shootings, with non-fatal shootings making up the bulk of it at about 75% in any given year. And so a lot of the data I'm talking to you all about today is homicide data, because that's what we have for every municipality in Allegheny County, but it actually dramatically undercuts how intense this issue is when we include non-fatal shootings. So important thing to note also at high level, this is a lot going on in this graphic, but the things I really want to point out is it's looking at different types of crime, homicides, violent crime, and property crime per 100,000 at different levels of geography. The US overall, the state of Pennsylvania, Allegheny County, and the city of Pittsburgh. And the thing really to take away here is that despite sort of popular media perception around this issue, particularly with the spike that many people have been discussing in 2020 and continued into 2021, as discussed on the previous slides, homicides is the only kind of crime we're actually seeing a dramatic increase in. Violent crime, which in this context includes other kinds of assaults that are not designated as a homicide, including sexual assaults and other kind of physical assault, has actually declined in recent years, including during the pandemic. And property crime has actually gone down significantly. So when we talk about the crime increase, we are most notably and really only talking about homicide spiking at different levels of geography in the United States. So when people often ask, why is crime spiking so intensely, again, homicides in particular, in 2020 and 2021, there's a couple of likely factors that experts speak to, folks like Patrick Sharkey, who's a sociologist at Princeton University. The first one is record sales in the purchase of guns and increase in gun carrying over the past few years. The second thing is probably something a lot of us can relate to, which is social isolation from key institutions and programs, resulting from the need to social distance. As we'll get into later in the presentation, when we talk about this population that is often involved in and tends to be also victims of violence, they are incredibly at risk for a variety of reasons. And when they lose the natural buffers like coaches and teachers, et cetera, that can help curtail and prevent violence, then we can expect a spike in violence. And lastly, legal cynicism, meaning just distrust in the authorities to settle disputes or to call them, period, and police withdrawal resulting from the very public displays of police violence that we've seen, particularly in the case of George Floyd and beyond. So I've talked about it a couple times already in the slides, but this one really brings it home. And who does violence most affect? And it's staggering. So this is looking at homicide rates by age, gender, and race of homicide victims in Allegheny County. This is data from the past 5 years per 100,000. And what we can clearly see in this chart is two things. Black men in particular are overwhelmingly and disproportionately the victims of homicide. in Allegheny County. And when we look at what kind of Black men, we're particularly talking about young Black men, specifically between the ages of 15 to 30, even more specifically between the ages of 20 to 25, with that being our typical peak regarding violence victimization. It's also important to note we see a small disproportionality for Black women as well, compared to the representation of the population in Allegheny County. And we see that white men and white women actually show up below what they're expected to given their representation in the population. This is another graphic really showing something that can sort of get really confusing in how this is talked about a bit. We have definitely lost youth, those under 18 to violence, particularly last year in Allegheny County during 2021. But overall, when we look across the last decade, most victims of violence actually tend not to be kids. They actually tend to be in that grouping I just referenced on the previous slide, really ages 18 to 30, specifically, again, really 20 to 25. So this does definitely impact our youth, and it is tragic every time it happens. But sometimes we can actually miss the most vulnerable population regarding violence victimization, who is in that age group where they're not as connected to really any kind of institution, particularly schools, because they are now out of high school and often not attending another secondary school. So another way to look at this is to really look at how we sit and how our most at-risk populations sit compared to other geographies. So when we look over the last 5 years in terms of homicide victimization rates, we can see that from really 2016 through 2020, over the past roughly 5 years, the US average for homicides per 100,000 is 5, and Allegheny County comes in at 9, which is almost twice the US homicide rate. So we are not having the struggles, luckily, that cities like Detroit and Baltimore and St. Louis have with homicides, but we definitely aren't seeing the sort of steep declines in the crime decline that cities like New York City and Boston had seen. So we sit kind of middle of the road over the US homicide rate regarding how this issue hits us locally. That said, it's always important to really zoom in. So when we look at just men in Allegheny County, we see that they're victimized at 15 per 100,000. When we zoom in on Black men in Allegheny County, it's 96 per 100,000, which is about 20 times the US average. And when we zoom in on young Black men in Allegheny County, that age range I've been discussing so far, it's more than 40 times the US average. Really puts into perspective how intensely young Black men in Allegheny County are affected by this issue. When we look at service involvement of homicide victims, and this is using data from our data warehouse at the Department of Human Services, where we have access to a variety of health, medical, and behavioral health data, what we can really see here is that a lot of our homicide victims are involved in a variety of our systems, most notably, which is a definite risk factor. The majority of those victims are involved in were involved in our criminal justice systems, either in the juvenile system or the adult system, probation and jail. We also see that a strong variety of them, luckily, are attached to things like public benefits regarding SNAP or TANF and residing in those sort of families. But overall, really what the slides illustrates is that there are contacts that meet these young men where there are, for good and for bad. We tend to know these at-risk young men in our systems. When we look at homicide of vendors, we see a pretty similar demographic to those who are victims. So overwhelmingly, over the past decade in Allegheny County, and this is data just specific to Pittsburgh because that's where we have offender data for DHS, we see that overwhelmingly offenders tend to be Black males at about 78% overall over the last decade. And I really want to note here on this slide and going forward that anytime we talk about that fact, we have to give it the greatest care, because there is a context for why Black men tend to be the most likely to be victims of violence, and also a very small proportion of them tend to be more likely, that we have to view from a public health lens, not a lens that is judgmental or moral or derogatory. And we'll get to that more when we talk about structural and individual causes of violence in our communities. When we look at service involvement of homicide offenders, again, this is data for the city of Pittsburgh specifically, because that's the data we have access to currently. We see a very similar portrait regarding involvement in various behavioral, health, and criminal justice systems. So when we talk about where homicide hotspots has occurred, as I started with on the first slide, it is a deeply concentrated public health phenomenon. If we look at the slide here on our left, this is looking at the county overall. This is a heat density map of homicides cumulatively over the past decade. And even if I were to change this up by year, a similar pattern tends to emerge if we just look at it by year and not over the same decade. When we look at the homicide heat map, red indicates a more hot spot and yellow being the brightest of spots where violence concentrates. That big yellow spot that you see on the map is really Homewood and bordering Wilkinsburg. When we look overall, we can see that violence is incredibly concentrated in the city of Pittsburgh, to some of its western boroughs, to the west of the city, and also in parts of the Mon Valley. If we zoom in specifically to Pittsburgh, again, deeply concentrated. So when we look at the figure on the right, we can see that violence is incredibly concentrated in our upper eastern neighborhoods: Homewood, Lincoln, Leamington, East Hills, and Larimer. Parts of the Hill District, specifically Middle Hill and Bedford dwellings. In the Hilltop, which is actually where I originally grew up before I moved to Brookline as a kid, and then the Hilltop, the northern tip of Carrick, Knoxville, Mount Oliver Borough and City, Belsuver, and Allentown. And then the West End, we're talking about Sheridan most specifically. To the west, we're talking about McKees Rocks and Stowe. And then again, to the east, and we can really see that yellow spot hitting intensely, we're talking about Wilkinsburg and that border with Homewood. When we look at the Mon Valley, which is our other deep regional concentration, we're talking about the upper Mon Valley and the lower Mon Valley. In the upper Mon Valley, we're talking about Braddock, North Braddock, Rankin, and East Pittsburgh, and then Homestead. And then in the southern Mon Valley, we're talking about our other cities in Allegheny County, which are Duquesne, McKeesport, and Clarendon. Another way to look at this is looking at homicides per 100,000 by different geographies, with the table on our left looking at Pittsburgh neighborhoods, the table on our right looking at municipalities. And really much of what I just sort of said on the sort of slides showing the hotspots shows up here. Important to note that in the city, again, Homewood per capita, not just cumulatively, tends to have the highest concentration on average. And in the county as a whole, Wilkinsburg, Rankin, McKees Rocks tend to be some of our top municipalities when we talk about effects for violence. So it's important to note out here, and really the last couple slides here before we can kind of open this up for discussion if folks have questions, is to talk about structural causes and individual causes of violence. And I want to start with structural causes. So disproportionate gun violence in higher need, often Black communities, because of our relationship with discriminatory policies, is the result of systemic racism, exclusion, and disparate impact, full stop. When we talk about this, and we can talk about this at great length, but for today, I'll keep it short. What I mean by that is there is a policy or set of policies over really the past century that have really shaped neighborhoods and how much they vary in the conditions that are present in those neighborhoods. So we have to talk about explicitly racist housing, lending, and land use policies from the early 1900s to the 1960s. And it's still important to note that we have ample evidence of things like racial steering and land discrimination to this day. Literally studies from even last year showing pretty significant gaps despite the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, more than 50, 60 years ago. On your left, you'll see a redlined map of Pittsburgh, which luckily this topic is getting much more attention in recent years regarding the sort of policies that shaped our neighborhoods and the investments they did receive. It's important to state, though, that redlining is really the tip of the iceberg and is in a lot of ways just a reinforcer of existing trends and a preclusion of forthcoming trends. And so we really have to talk about racial zoning in the early 1900s. We have to talk about the neighborhood composition role from the FHA as a prelude to the Department of Urban and Housing Development, which really noted that public housing had to be placed in neighborhoods where it was segregated based on the neighborhood composition. We got to talk about things like block busting. We got to talk about things like contract housing. We have to talk about a number of these mechanisms in federal, state, local government, and interpersonally with private institutions and individuals carrying out racial discrimination. We also have to talk about white flight, outmigration, and suburbanization, with a lot of policies in the 40s, 50s, and 60s actually allowing the steep outmigration we saw, including in cities like Pittsburgh from the 1950s onward, because of highway construction and subsidized suburbanization, and the mortgages that were granted to often white families and not Black ones. We have to talk about urban renewal, which is actually a response to outmigration and cities trying to reclaim their tax base by trying to make parts of their cities more appropriate in terms of suburban amenities, our automobile accessibility, and also trying to deal with the issue of concentrated poverty, which was created from the conversation we just had around these policies in the 1900s, by not addressing it, but simply tearing it down. The most obvious example being the Civic Arena and the displacement of about 8,000 Black residents from the Hill into parts of the Upper Eastern neighborhoods in the East End and some of our Eastern boroughs, but also in Allegheny City and East Liberty. We have to talk about deindustrialization, which had a giant impact on our region, not just in Pittsburgh, but especially in the Mon Valley. And it's important to state that it had a disproportionate impact on Black people in general and low-wage workers of all races, including white workers. And as we can see on some of these maps, and we'll get to in a coming slide, the violence is deeply concentrated in our neighborhoods, even more affected from not just outmigration from decades before, but the lasting impact of job loss, tax base loss, business loss. We have to talk about how we responded to the crack cocaine epidemic in the 80s, which really lit a match in these vulnerable communities because of lack of opportunity and just hopelessness, and how we responded to it not with a public health approach, but through intense state violence. And lastly, exclusionary zoning is a form of legal discrimination that has a disparate impact on low-income people, and given our disproportionate amount of low-income Black, Indigenous, and Latino people, a disproportionate impact on them. So these intentional policy decisions made Black and poor communities vulnerable to violence and community trauma as the result of their concentrated disadvantage and disinvestment, socially alienating residents from resources, opportunities, key institutions, and networks, and through the entrenchment of legal cynicism resulting from racism in our criminal justice system, all of which destabilize the social fabric of these communities. There's a lot in one slide, but we have to talk about this when we talk about violence. Important to note, this is the Community Need Index that I was actually the primary author for our most recent iteration, where we look at the census tract level, we look at those neighborhood level factors that tend to be predictive of adverse outcomes for families, so that we can use these kind of maps to better allocate the services that we fund and deliver at the Department of Human Services. When we talk about need and those factors that matters most, probably to no surprise to people on the call, we're talking about poverty, unemployment, lack of educational attainment, rate of single parent households, and other measures related to socioeconomic status, behavioral health, and health. And when we look at really divvying those out across need from our communities, you'll see that the census tracts here that are in blue and dark blue on the county focus map and on the city focus map here are the exact same communities we've been talking about for much of this presentation regarding the concentration of violence, with nearly 70% of homicides disproportionately occurring in these higher need communities. So structures relate to the opportunity for crime to really come forth. Another way to look at this regarding the kind of racial disparities we see in homicides is having to look at the disparities we see in residents within different kinds of needy communities. So this is looking at families by need index that I just described. And it's basically looking at, different people by race below the poverty line and different people by race above the poverty line. And to really focus on the figure on the left here in orange and red, what we can see here is that nearly 4 out of 5 Black people below the federal poverty line live in higher need communities, the communities most disproportionately impacted by violence as well, where even poor white and Asian individuals in Allegheny County, less than 1/4 of them tend to reside in these communities. And if we look at it on the other side, even Black people above the poverty line, almost 50% of them live in our most disadvantaged communities versus less than 10% of white and Asian individuals above the poverty line. And we look at the figure to the right, it's basically a mirror image when we talk about residents in our very low need communities, which tend to be the communities that produce the best outcomes for families in the long run. But we can't talk about structural causes without individual causes of community violence, because it's important to point out that despite this overwhelming residence in higher need communities by particularly our Black population, because of our history of discrimination that we've outlined so far and these other trends that have hit vulnerable communities most hard over the last century, only a small percentage of at-risk young men in higher communities tend to be involved in gun violence. Typically, we see only anywhere from 1 to 2% of a population disproportionately causing almost 50, 70, 80% of violent crime. So it's hyper concentrated not just in place, but hyper concentrated in who is victimized and who tends to offend. Some of those individual causes are intense trauma, with these young men not just growing up in disadvantaged communities who are likely to be involved, but have overwhelming trauma within their households as well, anything from abuse to neglect. When we talk about other risk factors, easy access to a gun, with alcohol typically being involved when violence occurs, peer pressure to be involved in violence, and for various reasons, distrust in the authorities, which tends to make mediation not between legal parties, but into people taking the matters into their own hands. And also being involved in the small co-offending network really increases the likelihood you'll be a victim of yourself, meaning that being socially linked to a homicide victim as a young man tends to increase dramatically the likelihood that you'll be a victim of yourself. Most of this violence tends to result of beefs, typically starting online, where young men feel disrespect for their reputation, perceived or real, or it's retaliatory in response to other violence, like losing a friend. So as we sort of finish up here, I just want to note that violence affects the entire community, not just the small number of men involved and victimized. We have plenty of studies I could cite here, but I'll just pull out a few. So we have studies where we look at kids in the exact same, not just neighborhood, but block group in very similar types of families who attend the same school. And there's findings in New York, Chicago, and LA that kids in that exact same condition had IQ scores that fell half a standard deviation below average if one child took an IQ test within a week of a local murder, all else equal, and one other kid did not. So when we talk about things like educational outcomes, we can't just talk about the quality of the school, but exposure to violence in spite of the quality. These kids are not dumb, they're just incredibly traumatized. I can speak to this as well as a kid who grew up in a pretty complicated low-income home. Exposure to gun violence is also linked to higher risk of suicidal ideation and psychotic experience and levels of depression and distress. We know that violence leads to outmigration and further disinvestment, which just keeps reinforcing these cycles we discussed so far. And lastly, it's important to note that as we talk about police violence, noting that police violence is also incredibly concentrated in poor communities. And exposure to this leads to persistent decreases in GPA, increased incidence of emotional disturbance, and lower rates of high school completion and other outcomes. So some of the things to end on, hopefully a more positive note, is that we can affect violence in a positive way through a public health lens and a way that can substantially reduce non-fatal shootings and homicides. But we do have to address some of the barriers that make it hard to have effective violence prevention. So community-based organizations have been on the front lines of this issue for decades, but they often face challenges that may inhibit their ability to curb violence. To help address this, the Department of Human Services, where I'm actually the project lead on this initiative, released 2 major RFPs to fund public health interventions to violence that I'll get to in the final slide. But we're doing this through funding effective violence reduction efforts rooted in evidence-based programs in a sustainable way, building coordination, not just within highly impacted communities we've discussed so far, but across them, with homicides not always respecting neighborhood or municipal boundaries, supporting staff needed to implement these strategies, and lastly, connecting community groups with the developers of these evidence-based programs to get the technical assistance they need to implement them with fidelity. So when we talk about evidence-based violence reduction models from a public health lens, they tend to have a number of principles in common, meaning they tend to focus only on those people most at risk for victimization from or involvement with violence. They connect at-risk young men with trauma-informed care and help them manage impulse control, often through cognitive behavioral interventions. They provide wraparound services to help stabilize and improve the lives of at-risk young men, to help them meet basic needs like housing, food, etc. They reduce the opportunity to commit community violence, sometimes literally, when we talk about, say, crime prevention through environmental design, like things like lot remediation and things of that nature, reducing blight. And lastly, providing peer support and interrupting violence through credible messengers that know these communities and the young men in them. So the RFPs that DHS released to do this just as of January 2022 is one, the RFP for community violence reduction plans from high priority areas, which is about funding sustainable evidence-based and coordinated public health approaches to violence reduction within highly impacted communities. And the second one, RFP countywide support for violence reduction, which is about funding sustainable evidence-based coordinated approaches across highly impacted communities, with coordination, particularly in this space, being paramount. And lastly, on this last slide, just to describe a little bit what we're asking in these RFPs, and I ask anyone to call because these are both still open to share the link, and I can put it in the chat for folks interested. RFP 1 asks stakeholders in highly impacted communities to, 1, create a community violence reduction plan where they can choose to fund both existing efforts they're already doing and underway that show promise, and choose from several evidence-based practices that have been shown to reduce violence. And secondly, choose a lead agency to coordinate these violence reduction efforts on behalf of their community. Some of the programs we're talking about here are Cure Violence, Becoming a Man, and Ready Chicago. Happy to talk about those more if folks have questions on what these programs do. And secondly, and lastly, because I am at time at 30 minutes, RFP 2 chooses a county-wide convener to bring together all relevant actors across the county, including those in government, university, health, and community, and also funds efforts that make more sense to operate centrally, things like hospital-based intervention, victim support, and homicide review boards. Thanks, Tiffany, for having me. I just talked way too long for 30 minutes, so I'm happy to take any questions and kind of stop sharing the screen here.
Do have a question. Could you touch very briefly on your experience living in a community that had a lot of violence?
Yeah, it actually shaped just about everything in my life. So when I was younger, almost our whole family, like we're Pittsburgh through and through, for better and for worse. I think we've been on the Mon Valley side of the river in city limits for like 120 years, so we can't leave this place. So a lot of my family's from Knoxville, Belsuver, Southside, Carrick. And most of our family when I was growing up was in Knoxville. And this was in the 80s and 90s when violence, while we would see it resurface as highs, including last year, was at its peak in the early 1990s, late 80s, particularly as the crack epidemic was raging. And again, the after effects of deindustrialization. All that being said, my mom and dad, despite being pretty low income, my dad's an electrician, my mom was just on disability. They made the decision to actually move us away from family to go to a neighborhood that was safer. That was the primary reason we left. I think it's important to note, I think one of the reasons they could do that is because despite our challenges, my parents are white. And it was easier for them to get in certain neighborhoods than, say, some of my peers I grew up with who were not. And so we moved to Brookline. And for any of you that have been to Brookline, it is not wealthy. This is not Mount Lebanon. This is not Squirrel Hill. This is not Point Breeze. But you know what it is? It's safe. It has an incredible amount of extracurricular activities that were accessible to me growing up, like Boy Scouts and sports programs. I could use the neighborhood as my backyard. And there was a ton of peer support from neighbors in this working class, growing kind of middle class community. So you don't need to live in a wealthy neighborhood to do okay. You just need to live in a safe neighborhood that's well resourced. And so that was kind of my history, is that, I had been exposed to some violence growing up in the community in Knoxville, but we moved before it ever had a lasting impact. And I think that changed my life pretty dramatically, which is why I focus on neighborhoods. So hope that answers the question. That wasn't too detailed.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Muted.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you, Nick, for coming. And yeah, now we'll take a 5-minute break.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Tiffany, I'll send you.
All right. And next we have the Schweitzer quote. So the quote says, "The thinking person must oppose all cruel customs, no matter how deeply rooted in tradition and supported by a halo. When we have a choice, we must avoid bringing torment and injury, into the life of another." So I guess with this quote, I want you to think about how does, and with the topic we discussed today, how that applies to you and how that applies to you all working with your communities. Anyone want to start?
Yeah, I think like something that's interesting, I think for Stan and myself right now is how like in our project we are hearing a lot of stories about how like the custom of medical racism is very real in American hospitals. And it's almost, well, it's not almost, it like has really become rooted in tradition, like in the way that people are trained to. Those you know practices that manifest racism are kind of passed on and on. So I think like as someone who's going through medical school right now, there's like a choice that I have to, you know, decide that I'm not going to practice things in this way, get annoyed in the way that people tend to get annoyed at the people they tend to get annoyed at. Yeah.
I agree. I believe like what you said was really good as, you know, self-reflection and making sure that you don't oppose like racism and helping to stop that is pretty good. So yeah. Anyone else?
Yeah, I really liked Brune's perspective on that. I think the Beyond Borders presentation we had last month, like speaking about like kind of just like diving back into Schweitzer's life, and just like thinking in this case, like right, like he was a part of the era of colonialism, and at the time, I imagine him opposing that, where people were like, "What? Like this is what we do," you know? So I think that, like, yes, we can see these issues that are wrong in our society right now and want to try and fix them. But I think the action of what Varun is talking about, the necessity to actually make it an active thought and an active process of how you're going to change that is really important to actually see change occur.
I think it also stems from having your own personal core values at the heart of all the action that you do compared to what society is telling you to do. And obviously there's a balance of being part of society. You have to be aware of what's acceptable or not. But I think what you both are mentioning is how like Schweitzer led with what he thought his core values were. And that's how he led life. And I feel like all the quotes that we've talked about in the past have been like, you do it from what's inside of you. And that is what guides you compared to letting life happen to you. You are in charge of creating, you know, that difference from within.
Right. I agree. I believe like if someone is not shown that in their everyday life, then they're not thinking about it, and then they're not going to want to or do something that will help make a change or make a difference. where they are. So I agree. Anyone else?
I do also want to say, like, as a like opposite view to this, I think we also have to make sure that things that we consider like cruel customs actually are cruel customs, because things that we perceive as outsiders may be different than what like people within their own cultural group like see them as. Like one example that comes to mind is when people wear like hijabs. A lot of times the people who wear them think that's empowering, but other people may think that that is somehow like suppressing women. So I just want to like make sure that we think about what people actually think is cruel to themselves as well.
That's a really good point, and something I was going to ask is whenever you do come across those types of those customs or those practices that maybe you don't have a complete understanding of, like what is your go-to on trying to figure it out, and how do you work with the community to figure out what the best direction is moving forward, sorry, with them individually or with a group? Just curious to know anyone's thoughts on that.
To answer your question, Rebecca, I believe you can only do what you think is right. And so if you believe, because you're not from that group, you may have your own imposed thoughts, but that's only because you're doing what you think is right. And so anything you do may seem as wrong because you're not from that group, but know in your heart, like you only did it out of the kindness of what you thought was right from your perspective. And so you can't, I guess you can't put blame on somebody for not having internally knowing how that person would feel or react. So. Anyone else?
To add to Rebecca's question, I think that that's why it's important to educate ourselves, especially as health professionals who will be coming into contact with people of many different cultures and traditions. Like making sure that at least, especially if you're with one specific group for doing your projects, like making yourself aware of their customs and traditions and like the way that family dynamics work, I think is really important, because I kind of agree with what you said, Tiffany, on terms of like, yeah, you do what you think is right, but it's like you can't just also self-impose your own personal beliefs on a decision that you're gonna take, because at the end of the day, it could possibly harm like one of the patients that you might be seeing, and they might actually take offense to something like that, because you might be doing it out of the kindness of your own heart, but they don't know that. Like you're not having that conversation with them, and it can be really harmful to them.
Right. You bring up a really good point, Patricia. Yeah, I get that a lot within just my community, but yeah, I know how, I can see how that like stems out to like different communities overall. So. Anyone else? All right. Well, we are at the end